He said, "I'm still young." The words came out with a grin, the kind of grin that belongs to someone who's never truly faced consequences. The courtroom chuckled uneasily. Even the judge paused, her pen hovering midair. "You're 21, Mr. Harlan," she said softly. "Not immortal." The young man shrugged, eyes glinting with arrogance. Cameras clicked. He thought the trial was a show, a brief inconvenience before returning to the same life he had broken. But justice has a way of erasing illusions. It started small, the quiet turn of a page, the creak of a chair as the victim's father stood up to testify. His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from years of grief pressed into a single sentence. "He laughed," the father said, pointing at the defendant. "While my son was dying, he laughed." The air shifted. The smirk faded. The jury leaned forward, every face hardening in the same quiet disbelief. The judge removed her glasses, eyes heavy but sharp. "Is that true, Mr. Harlan?" He looked down. For the first time, words failed him. "You said you were young," she continued. "As if youth could erase cruelty. As if time owed you forgiveness." He tried to smile again, but it wouldn't come. "Not here, not anymore." The prosecutor placed a single photo on the table, a graduation picture. The victim's face frozen in a smile that would never age. "He was young too," the prosecutor said. The courtroom fell silent. No camera clicked this time. No one moved. Even the air felt heavier, colder. And as the judge leaned forward, her voice calm but final, she said the words that would follow him forever. "You're right. Mr. Harlan, you are young. That means you'll have a very long time to remember what you've done." The gavel struck once. His youth, once a shield, became his sentence. He stood there, hands trembling slightly. The words, "I'm still young," still echoing in his head like a curse. The courtroom was no longer a stage. It was a mirror, showing him the reflection of what he had done. Behind him, his mother wept quietly, her tears mixing with years of disbelief. Across the room, the victim's sister clutched a silver bracelet, twisting it again and again as if it could bring her brother back. The defense attorney leaned in, whispering something about remorse, but it was too late for that word to mean anything. The judge's eyes were fixed on him, calm but unrelenting. "Do you believe age erases responsibility, Mr. Harlan?" she asked. He couldn't answer. He thought about the parties, the laughter, the reckless speed of youth. None of it mattered now. "The only difference between you and the man you killed," she said, "is that he didn't get a chance to grow older." "You did." A long pause followed. Then she added, "And that is exactly why this sentence must stand." The gavel hit the wood, echoing like thunder in a church. The crowd didn't cheer or gasp, they just watched, silent, heavy. The camera light blinked off. His story had ended where it began, in a room built for truth. The sound of the cell door closing behind him felt heavier this time, not because of the steel, but because of the silence that followed. Harlan sat down on the cold bench, his head low, the echo of the judge's voice still ringing in his ears. "You'll have a long time to remember." He could still hear it, soft, calm, unshakable. The guards had left him alone, and for the first time since his arrest, he didn't reach for excuses. He didn't think about his age or his future or how unfair life was. He thought about the moment everything changed, the night that started it all. It wasn't rage. It wasn't hate. It was pride, the kind that makes you believe you're bigger than consequences, the kind that disappears the moment you see what you've done. He pressed his palms together, staring at the thin beam of moonlight cutting through the bars. Somewhere in the distance, another inmate shouted. Another laughed. But inside his cell, Harlan whispered one word to no one. Why? Not for pity, not for forgiveness. Just the kind of question that doesn't expect an answer. The moonlight shifted, landing on the small Bible left by a prison chaplain earlier that day. Harlan didn't open it, not yet, but his eyes lingered on the cover, as if it might hold something more than pages, maybe a reason, maybe peace. For the first time, he stopped fighting the silence and let it speak. The first rays of morning slipped through the narrow window of Harlan's cell, painting the walls in pale gold. He hadn't closed his eyes once. Every time he blinked, the courtroom came back, the faces, the gavel, the sound of his own voice saying, "I'm still young." The words haunted him now. They didn't sound proud anymore. They sounded small. The cell door creaked open. "You've got company," a guard muttered. A new inmate stepped in, older, quiet, carrying a stack of books instead of anger. "You're the kid who mouthed off to the judge," the man said. Not cruelly, just stating a fact. Harlan didn't respond. The man set the books on the small table. "I used to think age mattered too," he said. "Turns out it doesn't. Only what you do next does." Then he sat down, opened one of the books, and started to read. The silence that followed wasn't heavy like before. It was strange, almost calm. Harlan stared at the bars, then at the small Bible still lying on his bunk. His fingers hesitated, hovering above it. For the first time, not because he had to, but because he wanted to, he opened it. Dust rose from the pages. The first line his eyes landed on wasn't about punishment or forgiveness. It was about truth. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. But for the first time, he breathed without guilt. Days passed inside those gray walls, each one blending into the next. Harlan began writing. At first it was nonsense, a way to pass time, to keep from drowning in silence. But slowly the words started to mean something. He didn't write about the crime, or the trial, or even the judge. He wrote about the noise that filled his head, the weight of guilt that refused to fade, and the memory of a world that kept turning without him. He wrote to no one in particular, just to let the truth out. One night, he folded one of those pages and slipped it into an envelope addressed simply, "To anyone who still believes people can change." Weeks later, that letter made its way beyond the prison gates. It found its way into the hands of a volunteer working at a youth program. She read it aloud to a room of teenagers who thought rules didn't matter, who thought they were untouchable, just like Harlan once did. When she finished, the room was silent. No one laughed. No one mocked. One boy in the back whispered, "He sounds like me," back in his cell. Harlan didn't know any of that. He just kept writing, unaware that his words had already escaped long before he ever could. The pen moved across the paper, slow and steady, not to rewrite his past, but to finally understand it. It started with a single envelope. A volunteer named Clara found it buried under a stack of old prison correspondence, unclaimed, yellowed, and sealed with uneven handwriting that read, "For those who think." It's too late, she opened it, expecting. Another routine apology. Another cliché from a man who'd lost everything. But the words stopped her. "I used to think time was my shield," the letter began. "That being young meant I could always start over. But youth isn't freedom, it's a test. And I failed mine." The honesty was raw, almost painful. Clara read it twice, then again. The next day, she showed it to her editor at the State Tribune. "It's powerful," he said, "but no one knows who wrote it." "Maybe that's the point," Clara replied. Within a week, the piece titled "The Confession of an Unknown Inmate" was published online. It didn't explode, it spread like a whisper. First among teachers, then community groups, then parents who saw pieces of their children in those words. "I'm still young," the letter said near the end, "but I no longer say it with pride. I say it as a reminder that youth is a privilege, not an excuse." The quote appeared on posters, blogs, classrooms. Inmates began asking for copies. Even the judge, Eleanor Price, read it one morning over coffee, her breath catching halfway through. She didn't know, not yet, who the writer was, but something about the tone, the humility, felt familiar. Later that afternoon, she called the warden. "Do you know who wrote a letter beginning with, 'I used to think time was my shield'?" There was a long silence on the other end. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "That was Harlan." The judge said nothing for a moment. She only looked out the window at the rain streaking down the glass and whispered, "He finally listened." Across the city, in his small gray cell, Harlan had no idea that his words were out there changing people. He just kept writing, one page after another, unaware that his redemption had already begun, not in court, not in freedom, but in the echo of his own truth. Years slipped by, quiet and unremarkable, until one gray afternoon a visitor request arrived at Stonefield Correctional. The name on the line made even the warden blink twice, Judge Eleanor Price. When Harlan was escorted into the visitation room, his hands trembled. The years had changed him. The sharp edges of arrogance were gone, replaced by calm, almost fragile humility. Across the table, the judge looked older, her hair silvered, her presence still commanding but softened by time. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she smiled faintly. "You didn't expect to see me again, did you?" Harlan shook his head. No, ma'am. Her voice was steady. I read your letter. He looked down, unsure whether to thank her or apologize. I wasn't trying to make excuses, he said quietly. I just wanted to tell the truth. Finally. You did, she replied. And the truth always finds its way. Mr. Harlan, the silence that followed wasn't heavy. Anymore, it was almost peaceful. She studied him for a long moment. Do you still believe you're too young to understand consequences? He exhaled slowly. No, Your Honor. I think I was too young to understand compassion. Her eyes softened. That's something most people never learn, no matter how old they get. They sat together in silence for a while, the rain tapping against the window like a familiar memory. Then, unexpectedly, the judge reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folded newspaper, the same article that had once started it all. Do you know what this did? She asked. Harlan shook his head. It saved a life, she said simply. A teenager wrote to me last year. He said he stopped himself from doing something terrible because of these words. She placed the paper on the table between them. You may never leave this place, Harlan, but part of you already has. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to smile. Not the careless grin of a boy who thought he was untouchable, but the quiet, grateful smile of a man who finally understood grace. When the guards came to escort him back, Judge Price stood and extended her hand. Thank you for listening, she said. No, he whispered, shaking her hand gently. Thank you for not giving up on justice. As she turned to leave, the sunlight broke through the clouds, spilling gold across the gray concrete floor, soft, fleeting, and full of something neither of them could quite name. Weeks passed after Judge Price's visit, but her words stayed with him like sunlight lingering after rain. Harlan began to notice, things he never used to, the way the guards greeted each other in the morning, how the world still moved even when he wasn't part of it. His cellmate Raymond would sometimes joke, "You look like you're waiting for something." Harlan would smile faintly. Maybe I am. But what he was waiting for wasn't freedom. It was peace. One afternoon, a guard handed him a stack of letters. They were all addressed to him, written in different handwriting. He opened one. It was from a high school student. Your story changed my life. I don't know you, but I wanted to say thank you. Another came from a teacher who'd read his letter to her class. You gave my students something real to think about, Harlan. Held the papers in his hands, stunned. Every line felt like a thread pulling him closer to the world he thought he'd lost. He wasn't forgotten. The next day, he asked the prison librarian for blank paper. Planning another confession? The man joked. No, Harlan said. A reply. That evening, under the weak light of a flickering bulb, he began to write again, not to justify, not to regret, but to give something back. To everyone who read my words, he wrote, I'm not the boy who mocked the judge anymore. I'm just a man learning how to live with what I've done, and how to do some good with what's left. His handwriting was steadier now. The anger, the pride, the denial, they were gone. In their place was something fragile but real, purpose. Outside his window, the sunset turned the gray sky into gold. For the first time in years, the walls around him didn't feel like punishment. They felt like protection, a place where redemption could quietly grow. Months later, Harlan became part of a small prison program called Second Voice. It was designed for inmates who showed genuine rehabilitation, those who could use their experience to reach others before they made the same mistakes. He didn't want to join at first. Who'd listen to me? He asked the counselor. She smiled gently. The ones who need to. The first time he stood in front of the small group of new arrivals, young men, barely older than he had been, he froze. Their eyes were empty, filled with the same arrogance he once wore. But when he began speaking, something changed. I said I was still young, he told them quietly. I thought it meant I had time. But all it meant was I didn't understand how fast time disappears. The room fell silent. He didn't talk about punishment or guilt. He talked about choices, small ones that stack into a life you can't undo. When the session ended, one of the youngest inmates approached him. Do you think people like us can ever start over? Harlan smiled faintly. You already have. You just showed up. From then on, every Thursday he stood in that room, talking about the difference between youth and wisdom, about the cost of pride, about the quiet freedom that comes from owning your truth. Word spread. Even God stopped to listen. The program grew, slowly but steadily. Harlan no longer wrote letters just for himself. He wrote lesson plans, speeches, small notes for others who couldn't yet find their voice. In a place built for punishment, he'd somehow built something else, purpose. And while the world outside might never know his name, within those walls his story lived on, whispered from one cell to another like a promise that even broken people could still teach others how to stay whole. It began with a letter from the outside, one written on clean white paper instead of the recycled brown Harlan was used to. The return address read simply, Clara Whitmore, the State Tribune. Inside was a single line. They want to publish your writings. Harlan read it 3 times, half expecting it to be a mistake. For years his words had belonged to silence, traded only between inmates and counselors. Now someone beyond these walls wanted to give them a voice. The warden called him into his office a week later. A publisher reached out, he said. They're compiling your letters into a book. They're calling it Still Young. Harlan's hands shook. That was the thing I said in court. I know, the warden replied, eyes soft. It's why it matters. When the first printed copies arrived, Harlan didn't get one. Instead, the warden handed him a newspaper clipping with a review, written by a man who found truth where most lose it. Still Young is less a confession and more a mirror. It forces us to ask who we might have become if no one had stopped us. Across the country, universities used excerpts in ethics classes. High schools distributed the text during assemblies about accountability. Even Judge Price was invited to speak at one of those events. Standing on the stage, she held up the book and said, "This isn't about forgiveness. It's about what happens when someone finally listens." Back in his cell, Harlan sat at his desk, staring at the empty notebook in front of him. He picked up his pen, hesitated, then wrote a single line on the first page. My sentence began the day I thought I was free. He didn't smile when he finished. He just exhaled, a quiet, steady breath that sounded, for the first time, like peace. The world outside kept reading, unaware that the man who'd once mocked the judge had become something far rarer, a voice of understanding in a world that had nearly silenced him. The letter arrived on a rainy afternoon, carried by the same guard who'd once escorted Harlan in chains. From outside, he said, sliding it through the slot. No return name. Harlan frowned. Most letters now came from readers, students, or journalists. But the handwriting on this one was shaky, almost trembling. He opened it slowly. The first line froze him. You don't know me, but you knew my brother. His breath caught. The rest of the letter blurred before his eyes as he kept reading. I hated you. For years I wanted you to suffer like we did. But I read your book. I heard your words. And for the first time, I realized you weren't running anymore. You were facing what you did. My brother wouldn't have wanted more hate in the world. He'd have wanted understanding. So this isn't forgiveness. It's release. For both of us. The signature at the bottom read simply, Lena Parker. Harlan sat there for a long time, the paper trembling in his hands. He reread the last line again and again. It's release. That night, he didn't write. He didn't pray. He just sat beneath the flickering light, letting the silence settle into something softer. When the guard came by for rounds, he found Harlan awake, staring at the window where the rain shimmered under the moonlight. You good? The guard asked. Harlan nodded slowly. Yeah, he whispered. I finally am. The next morning, he placed the letter between the pages of Still Young, right beside his first words. I used to think time was my shield. For the first time, the sentence didn't sound like guilt anymore. It sounded like closure. Time softened everything inside Stonefield. The shouting at night grew rarer. The anger in the halls dulled. And Harlan's name turned into something whispered with respect. He was no longer the arrogant kid who mocked the judge. To most of the younger inmates, he was just Mr. Harlan, the man who listened. His program, Second Voice, expanded beyond the prison walls. Schools streamed his talks. Churches shared his writings, and volunteers sent transcripts to youth centers across the country. Yet Harlan never asked for recognition. He still lived in the same narrow cell, still woke before dawn, Still wrote by hand on paper that yellowed too quickly. One morning, a reporter visited to write an anniversary piece about Still Young. She asked, "Do you ever think about freedom?" He smiled faintly. "Every day," he said. "But not the kind that needs a gate to open." The article was published weeks later under the headline, "The Prisoner Who Freed Others." It reached Judge Eleanor Price. Now retired, she sat by her window with a cup of coffee, reading the words slowly. "He understands it now," she murmured. Later that week, she was invited to speak at a legal symposium. Cameras rolled as she addressed a hall full of law students. "When I sentenced Ethan Harlan," she said, "I thought I was ending a story. But justice doesn't end, it transforms. It breathes through those willing to face it." She held up a copy of Still Young. "This book isn't about guilt. It's about growth, about what happens when truth is allowed to evolve." The audience applauded. Not for her, not for him, but for the idea that somewhere between punishment and redemption lies something both had found, understanding. Back in his cell, Harlan folded another letter addressed to the youth program's new coordinator. It ended simply. "If even one person learns from my mistake, then the years I lost weren't wasted." The guard came by and smiled. "Mailing another sermon, preacher?" Harlan chuckled softly. "No," he said. "Just a reminder that stories don't die where they begin." Winter settled over Stonefield like a slow gray blanket. The years had thinned Harlan's hair and slowed his hands, but his mind was sharper than ever. He spent his mornings mentoring new arrivals, his evenings writing letters he no longer expected anyone to answer. The guards often found him sitting by the narrow window, watching snow fall in slow spirals. "Looks cold out there," one said once. "It's peaceful," Harlan replied. One afternoon, the prison chaplain stopped by his cell holding an envelope. "This came for you," he said. The handwriting was familiar, steady, deliberate. Harlan opened it carefully. "Mr. Harlan," it began, "I recently reread your letters. Every time I do, I find something new. You once wrote that redemption isn't about escaping punishment, but about understanding it. I believe that now more than ever. Thank you for reminding me that justice without empathy is only half complete. E. Price." Harlan smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. He placed the letter beside the one from Lena Parker, the two pages resting like opposite ends of the same truth. That night he began writing again, slower this time. "I used to measure my life by years," he wrote. "Now I measure it by the lives I've touched." The next morning, a group of younger inmates visited his cell. "They told us you're the reason this place feels different," one said shyly. Harlan laughed softly. "No, the reason is that you're willing to change." As they left, he looked down at the half-finished page in front of him. The ink had smudged slightly under his hand, but he didn't bother to fix it. Perfection no longer mattered. Truth did. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the prison yard in white. It made everything look still, untouched, as if even the world wanted to start over. Harlan whispered to himself, "Maybe we all do." The morning sun rose pale and distant over Stonefield Prison. The air was still, almost reverent, as if the world itself knew something was ending. When the guards made their rounds, they found Harlan sitting at his desk, pen still resting between his fingers. The final page of his notebook lay open, a single line written in his steady hand. "Some lives are defined by what they take. I hope mine is remembered for what it gave back." He was gone, peacefully, quietly, as though he had simply drifted into the silence he'd spent years learning to accept. Word spread quickly. The warden stood at the doorway of his cell, removing his cap. "He made this place different," he murmured. In the chapel, a small service was held. No cameras, no crowd. Only a few inmates, the chaplain, and a folded copy of Still Young placed beside a single candle. The flame flickered gently, its light dancing across the words that had changed so many lives. Outside, a snowflake landed on the chapel window and melted instantly. Miles away, in a quiet home filled with books and old photographs, Judge Eleanor Price received the news. She sat by her window, eyes closed, letting the weight of memory settle around her. Then she reached for her desk drawer and pulled out one of Harlan's first letters, the one that had started everything. She read the opening line again. "I used to think time was my shield. Then," softly she whispered, "and you turned it into your gift." That evening, At a small university lecture, Judge Price ended her speech with his final words. Justice, she said, is not about who deserves forgiveness. It's about who dares to change. The audience rose in silence. No applause, no cheers, just quiet respect. Outside, the snow began again, falling slow and gentle over the city. Somewhere in the echo of that stillness, Ethan Harlan's story lived on, not as a tragedy, but as proof that even the most broken souls can leave behind light.